Here comes of the House of Capulet.
Quarrel, I will back thee.
Anniversary of the death of the great playwright, not only of Britain, England, if you like it, would be better in his time, but I think on a world scale, he was a brilliant playwright and sonnet writer. And Basil is going to instruct us on the Marxist-Leninist perspective of it. It's not a perspective that is at all mentioned, either in the world of bourgeois theatre or in the world of bourgeois literature. So it'd be lovely to hear that.
Word fools, you know not what you do! Put up your swords!
What thou drawn among these heartless hinds? Turn thee, Benvolio, and look upon thy death.
I do but keep the peace. Put up thy sword, or manage to depart these men with me.
Peace? Peace? I hate the word, as I hate hell. All Montagues. And thee.
Bang, bang! Bang, bang! Personally, I was immensely pleased to be asked to make this presentation. I first encountered Shakespeare when I was about 13 years old, which I think is pretty much an ideal age to come across him. And I encountered him primarily through the theatre performances. Okay, we read him at school, we studied him at school. But every year, our wonderful English teacher took a group of us to see Shakespeare being performed at the Old Vic. I'm talking about pre-National Theatre days. So I was privileged to see Judi Dench in her very first London season as Ophelia, John Neville as Hamlet, a matinee idol of those days, now forgotten, Richard Burton as Henry V. Never forgave him for going to Hollywood. He was lost at the stage. And in '59, we actually went, a group of us, and stayed in Stratford, went to the RSC, saw Olivier as Coriolanus, and the wonderful Paul Robeson as Othello. So I had the most wonderful introduction to Shakespeare, but I was smitten from the beginning, and yet I couldn't just say why I found Shakespeare so wonderful. And later on, when I became acquainted with bourgeois criticism, I was even more at sea. In the middle of the last century, this was a typical and much lauded book of criticism of Shakespeare, The Wheel of Fire by G. Wilson Knight. And essentially, it's metaphysical. And the prose is almost impenetrable. It's virtually unreadable. I wasn't stupid then, I'm not particularly stupid now. I still find it virtually unreadable. Now, the fashion in Shakespeare criticism has changed fundamentally in the last 50 years. Now we have critics who in fact take a much more materialist point of view. They look concretely at the details of Shakespeare's life, insofar as it's known to us, and certainly it's known to us once he's on the stage in London, even though there's a gap when we don't know what happened to him. So you have books like 1599, A Year in the Life of Shakespeare, or 60 by James Shapiro. The same author has written recently 1606, The Year of Lear. We have Jonathan Bate, who's written a couple of books, The Soul of the Age and The Spirit of the Age. When he looks in detail at the text and analyses how this text and the knowledge shown through parts of the text show that a person such as Shakespeare could, and indeed did, write these. Because for a long while, bourgeois critics were convinced that a mere glover's son, perhaps the most accessible and most interesting in some ways, is Neil MacGregor. Neil MacGregor, Shakespeare's Restless World. You probably know of Neil MacGregor as the former director of the British Museum. He wrote A History of the World of 100 Objects and presented it on radio. Likewise, Germany, Memories of a Nation. And this is also 20 broadcasts, 50-minute broadcasts, looking at objects from Shakespeare's time and from them deducing what life was like in Shakespeare's Restless World. And you can still get the podcasts on the website, or you can read the book. Well worth doing. But none of these bourgeois critics, no matter how materialist their approach might now appear to be, none of them get to the essence of what makes Shakespeare great. And they can't, because to do so, you have to look at the class context and the class content. And of course, the whole of bourgeois culture, all of the bourgeois critics, all of the bourgeois academics, are intent on conveying the message that culture, all culture, is classless, class-free. There's no such thing as class in culture, because they want to try and make us believe that we are in a static, permanent situation, that there is no change. History is over, remember this? History is finished in 1989. There is no change. That there's no such thing as class, classes have gone, class conflict has gone, all as a means of lulling us into the belief that imperialism that we have now is permanent. Of course, no such thing. Now, I'm now going to read my presentation, and as I said, I would attempt not to sit here and bury my head in the print, but I must obviously use it to make sure that I don't miss things out or get things wrong. So the first question you might ask, why? Why at all do we talk about Shakespeare in this Donna Society, and why now? The obvious answer is that 23rd of April 2016 is the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare, the most celebrated dramatist of England and arguably of the world. The bourgeois media have been publicising this anniversary since the beginning of January, and bourgeois artists and academics are using the date to put on plays and publish books in the time-honoured fashion. But why should Marxist-Leninists care a jot? For the answer, I am going to draw unashamedly on the work of a brilliant Soviet critic and author, Alexander A. Smirnov. Thanks to our member, Jyoti Brar, who brought this to my attention recently, his brilliant booklet, Shakespeare, A Marxist Interpretation. And in my next monthly email, I'll give you all the reference where you can print it off on the web. Needless to say, out of print otherwise. I don't know precisely when this article was written, only that it apparently first appeared translated into English in 1936, when it was published by the Critics Group in New York. That fact alone is a reminder, if one were needed in present company, that of the great flowering of culture in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, during the revolutionary period of the building of socialism in the young proletarian state, under the leadership of the CPSUB and Comrade Stalin. It is also testimony to the great influence the example of the USSR had on progressive people all over the world, even in the USA. And there wasn't no question of even then. The USA was like everywhere else. It had its communist organisations, had its Communist Party, it had its progressives. We now associate it with the rampant anti-communist period of the McCarthyite era, but it was not always so. This booklet remained out of print for decades, but you can now get it on the internet. So it's available to all, and I'm going to encourage all of you to read it. I'm going to read extracts from it, but can't possibly read it all. Shakespeare's present status as an icon of English and world literature seems immutable and unchallengeable today, but it has not always been the case. The basis for his work was the precise time in which he lived. I hope to show how he could not have written as he did had he been born 50 years earlier or 50 years later. This, of course, is in direct contradiction to the bourgeois critics who laud Shakespeare as a genius for all times and all places who speaks of the eternal man, in their usual fashion of seeking to remove all class issues and all class content out of culture in order to support the bourgeois propaganda that we live in a society that is unchangeable in terms of its ruling class. Shakespeare chose to stop writing in the early 1600s and retired to Stratford, which had always remained his permanent home. After his death, he fell out of favour and out of fashion. I will first look at the society into which he was born and how that shaped both him and his work. Right, and then I will go on to look at Shakespeare's plays, but only briefly. We don't have time to analyse all of them, but you'll find an analysis of each play in this booklet. So we're looking at the period of the English Renaissance. This happened in the 16th century, later than on the continent. Every revolution, when the class rule of one class is replaced by that of another, has been accompanied by a flowering of culture. The upcoming class, while flexing its economic muscles, seeks to replace the ideas of the dying class with those of its own, which are more in tune with and supportive of the new economic relations. The European Renaissance is generally thought to have begun in Italy in the 15th century. It is said to have sprung from the rediscovery of the art and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. However, that rediscovery owes much to the work, usually ignored by the Eurocentric apologists for imperialism, of the scholars gathered in Baghdad between the late 8th century, with the founding of the House of Baghdad and the House of Wisdom there by the third Caliph, Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, until the 11th or 16th centuries, depending on which historian you read. I need hardly add that this era, known as the Golden Age of Islam, bears no resemblance whatsoever to the so-called Caliphate of Daesh, the reactionary Daesh. These Islamic scholars, for the first time, by translating the works of Greek, Roman, Indian and Chinese writers all into Arabic, for the first time united all these great sources of knowledge and made them accessible to scholars, the same scholars in the same place at the same time. And as a result of this, there were great leaps forward in maths, especially in maths, in science, as well as in culture. And the new Arabic knowledge made its way into Europe via Spain under the Moors. That religiously tolerant regime was finally replaced by the Catholic monarchs of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, the same year as they sponsored Christopher Columbus' voyage west. But then the Moors were expelled from Granada, completing the reconquest of Europe. And Ferdinand and Isabella proceeded to expel from their new kingdom all Muslims and all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. And in due course, of course, they also established the Inquisition to suppress any anti-Catholic tendencies. But it was no coincidence. This is one aspect of it, but that is not the real fundamental reason why there was a Renaissance. As we should know, as historical materialists, the Renaissance was the result of a change in the economic life of Europe. The economic forces changed. And it was no coincidence that the Renaissance saw its first great flowering in Europe, in Italy, and in particular in Venice, between the 14th and the 16th centuries. And by the late 15th century, Italy was acknowledged leader of the world, as it was known in Europe, in literature, music, philosophy, and other arts, as well as science. Venice, in an Italy of separate city-states, was the home of the merchant venturers, by reason of its situation on the East Adriatic coast of Italy, and its maritime culture, lacking as it did resources apart from what the sea provided. Venice was the state that began the sea trading voyages, which in due course replaced the overland routes to China, the Silk Road, which was not one, but several routes, and the spice islands through Arabia, Persia, and India. These voyages were extremely risky, both in lives and in money, but when successful, brought immense wealth back to Venice. When the merchant's ship came in, a phrase we still use today, he was wealthy beyond the dreams of his forebears. As the products of the East, silk, ceramics, and spices were all unobtainable, could not be made, could not be sourced in Europe, and were highly prized and commanded high prices. The newly wealthy merchants and their governments became patrons of the arts, replacing the Catholic Church as chief patron and paymaster in Venice. The merchants wanted all culture and art to reflect their own new importance and their new ideas. And in Venice, the explosion of talent in the visual arts in particular provided a lasting legacy of this period. Other maritime nations followed the example of Venice, anxious to get a share of this new wealth. Spain sent mariners westwards to look for another way to reach the Spice Islands of the East Indies, with the results well known to all. The Protestant Dutch, later, fighting for independence from Spanish Catholic rule from 1568, were on the point of defeat in 1588 until the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English Navy and the British weather gave them the opportunity to rally and fight back and win eventually victory and independence in 1609. The seafaring Dutch and the English both took to the high seas in search of new wealth. The era of colonialism had begun. The Dutch took control of some of the Spice Islands in order to secure a monopoly of their produce. The English mariners had at first just raided the Spanish ships as they sailed back with their cargoes of gold and silver from their new colonies in Central and South America. But the first English permanent colony outside British Isles, Jamestown, Virginia, named after James I and the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, was founded in North America in 1609, after earlier colonies had failed, notably the first so-called lost colony of Roanoke, founded by Sir Walter Raleigh in 1584-5, whose colonists were found by a relief ship in 1590 to have moved on and disappeared. Other significant developments had happened in England before this explosion in maritime exploits and exploration. We must now pay attention to these, as this unique combination of events is at the root of what happened in 16th century England, which in turn provided the context and inspiration for Shakespeare's work. Those significant developments were three. First, the end of the Wars of the Roses and the coming into power of Henry Tudor. Second, the expansion of the medieval wool trade to include finished goods as well as wool. And last but not least, the Reformation. I will look at each separately, though in truth they are interdependent. And I will look at the second of these factors first, since economic change always precedes political change. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century and reduced its population by between 30 to 60%, between 1348 and 1350, reduced England's population then 4 million by 1.5 million, creating an acute shortage of labour and starting the process of replacing serfdom with paid labour. This trend weakened the feudal ties of mutual obligation. Serfdom, whereby the peasant was tied to the land of his lord, growing food for his family on someone else's land, and having the shared use of the common land in return for payment in kind, crops and service, usually agricultural labour on the lord's land kept for his own use, and protection from invaders by the lord, disappeared from England during the 15th century. So this had gone by the time Shakespeare was born. The wool trade, and that's important for the development of the wool trade. The wool trade had long been important to the English economy. East Anglia, as you may know, is full of magnificent medieval churches. And these are known as the wool churches. They were built on the wealth that originated with the wool trade. And they are of a size and grandeur which bears no relation to the current day populations of those areas. In the 15th century, it was found to be more profitable to run sheep on land and produce wool than to wool for sale than to produce food. And then also it was found to be more profitable to sell cloth than wool. And this meant also that there was no use for serfs. They wanted to clear the peasants off the land, and the process of enclosures began then. They needed paid servants, paid workers to look after the sheep. And when they enclosed their land, or enclosed the land to provide sheep runs, they reduced the land available for peasants to produce food for themselves, further breaking down the old feudal relations between lord and peasant with mutual trust and independence, and creating the beginning of the army of landless labourers, which is a prerequisite for the development of capitalism. So while the economic landscape was slowly changing, as I've described, between 1455, the Battle of St Albans, and 1485, the Battle of Bosworth, the two branches of the English, Norman, French royal family, the House of Plantagenet, were involved in an internecine struggle over the succession to the crown of England. The conflict between the descendants of two of the sons of Edward III, the Dukes of Lancaster and York, is popularly known as the Wars of the Roses, after the badges of the two houses, the Red Rose of Lancaster, the White Rose of York. It really began when Richard II, the son of the eldest son of Edward III, the Black Prince who died during the wars in France, was deposed on 30 September 1399, dying in mysterious circumstances early the next year, and he was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, himself a son of Edward III, a younger son. But the battles started with the Battle of St Albans in 1455. Gaunt was Lancaster. And it began when the ultimate heir of Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, Henry VI, was challenged by the Yorkists. And these wars ended when the second Earl of Richmond, Henry Tudor, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth near Leicester. Richard III was the last legitimate male heir to the House of York, and he was the first who could trace his descent directly in the male line to Edward III. Henry VII, as he became, derived his claim from John of Gaunt, that same Duke of Lancaster, but through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. And Margaret Beaufort, as the name indicates, was the offspring, or was the descendant, of the children of John of Gaunt's third marriage. He married 3 times. The second time was to Isabella of Castile, and while he was married to Isabella of Castile, he had a mistress, long-term mistress, Catherine Swynford, whom eventually he married. And all of his children by Catherine Swynford were born during his marriage to Isabella of Castile, so basically illegitimate. And subsequently, when he married her mother, by Act of Parliament and by decree of the Pope, those children were legitimised. But the Act of Parliament specified they were legitimised on terms they could not claim the throne. But that's really the only claim to the throne that Henry VII had, through his mother, who was descended from the illegitimate children of John of Gaunt. So you can see his claim to the throne in dynastic terms was not particularly strong. And there are arguments, as we know, there are arguments still as to who killed the sons of Edward IV, who was the elder brother of Richard III, the so-called Princes in the Tower, whether it really was Richard III or was it Henry VII. Henry VII, in fact, had more reason to do it, because there was an Act of Parliament. After Edward IV died, and he was of the Yorkist persuasion, and his brother, Richard, became Lord Protector, looking after the young Edward V, who was a minor, King Edward. But then the Bishop of Bath and Wells got up in Parliament and said, but I was present at a ceremony when Edward IV was contracted to marry someone else before he married the Prince's mother, who was herself the widow Elizabeth Grey, née Woodville. So then Parliament decided and passed an act called Titulus Regius, declaring that the children of Edward IV were illegitimate, and that was why Richard III was then proclaimed king. So in a sense, he had nothing to lose by getting rid of them. After Richard III's death, Henry made a pact with the widow Grey, married her and Edward's daughter Margaret, and secured the repeal of the Act of Parliament bastardising Margaret and her brothers. In this way, he ended the strife between the two houses and founded the Tudor dynasty. Personally, I accept the view that Richard III was an honourable man, not a monster, and that Henry, not Richard, was the king who needed the sons of Edward, the princes in the Tower, out of the way. He needed Margaret to be legitimate to strengthen his claim, but of course if she was, then so were her brothers, who had a better claim than his. The version of history upon which Shakespeare wrote his play was written by the sainted Thomas More, who was Chancellor to Henry VIII and a babe in arms in 1485, and a chief apologist for the Tudor king, until Henry's taking the title of the head of the Church of England proved too much for More to swallow, and he died a Catholic martyr for refusing to swear the required oath of loyalty to Henry as head of the Church. And incidentally, More was also recognised as the first great humanist, author of Utopia. But regardless of his personal virtues or lack of them, history was not on Richard's side. What England needed, what the new situation in England needed, in fact, was Henry, not Richard. Richard's dynasty, the Plantagenets, was spent, largely wiped out by the wars, along with many of the most prominent of the feudal barons, and it was a feudal dynasty. Henry was supported by many of the younger sons of the great houses, those who had not been brought up to expect to inherit, and those who wanted an end to the wars and the uncertainty, and who wanted to foster trade. They wanted to pursue the new trade. And they knew that in supporting Henry, they would have the leverage to ensure a new order. And Henry VII did what was needed. He claimed to unite the two houses of York and Lancaster and adopted the Tudor rose, white on red petals, as a symbol of this unity. He effectively wiped out any remaining possible claimants to the throne. Both Henry VII and Henry VIII executed a fair few pretenders and possible rivals. He instituted a new legal regime whereby local courts were replaced by a national system of law, especially important in relation to markets. You no longer had lords' courts with separate rules. You began to have a unified system, so that traders could carry out their trade throughout the country knowing what the rules would be, rather than every court, every region having its own rules. He appointed loyal gentry in all the shires as justices of the peace with an obligation to uphold the laws. Most importantly, he concluded advantageous treaties with France and Holland to ensure freedom for the English to pursue the wool trade more profitably, and also secured a cheaper source of the alum essential for the creation of wool cloth, sidestepping the Pope's former monopoly and also amassing a considerable personal fortune. He married his daughter Margaret to the King of Scotland, James IV, and she was the grandmother of both of the parents of James I, who came to the throne after Elizabeth died without an heir. He had two sons, so when the elder died, the second was able to succeed on his death, becoming Henry VIII. So, like him or love him, Henry VII did a good job. He became an absolute monarch, and this is what is different from the feudal monarchs that preceded him. He had more power in his hands than the feudal monarchs did. He had no barons to contend with. And the infamous Jar Chamber was an expression of his autocratic rule. And the third event, which took a different form in England than on the continent, owing to the particular circumstances of Henry VIII, was the Reformation. Luther, reputedly, this may be a myth, had posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517, criticising the sale of indulgences and the excessive wealth of the church. His ideas had supporters in England. There had been noises for a long time about the need to reform the corrupt church. Kings in England before had tried to curb the power of the church, but with mixed results. Henry II was forced to give penance for the death of Thomas Becket, when the struggle for preeminence between church and state ended in the Archbishop's murder in December 1170. Edward I had passed through Parliament the Statutes of Mortmain in 1279 and 1290, forbidding gifts of land to the church in an effort to prevent the barons avoiding feudal service by disposing of their lands. Holding of lands equal the obligation to give feudal service to the king. Also, on passage of estates, taxes were payable to the king. So the king was trying to preserve his revenues. But then the church already owned vast lands and nothing was done about those. The movement for fundamental change personified in Luther, however, met with success in England because it chimed with two great interests of the state at that time. The need for a successor to Henry VIII and the king's need for supporters in his struggle with the Pope for a declaration that his marriage to his elder brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, which had produced no living male heir, was invalid. Henry kept the title of Defender of the Faith, originally given him by the Pope, but proceeded to take unto himself the Pope's authority over the church within England. He first executed Wolsey, who hadn't been able to obtain the decree of divorce or nullity from the Pope, and then with the aid of Thomas Cromwell and encouraged by his new queen, Anne Boleyn, an enthusiastic Protestant reformer, having obtained the divorce from the English bishops, proceeded to dissolve the monasteries and redistribute their lands between himself and his supporters, creating a new cohort of landowners and peers who saw their interests as allied to those of the merchants. What we are having is, in fact, is a bourgeoisified nobility, The nobility who now are holding land with a view to seeing how much money they can make out of their lands, rather than, as a feudal landlord, to see how many peasants and retainers he can have. It's a shift in emphasis. And the history of Henry VIII's reign, 1509 to 1547, is too well known to need further elaboration. He was followed by a period of extreme Protestantism under Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, who died before reaching majority, and the enforced but brief restoration of Catholicism under Mary I, 1534 to 1558, sorry, 54 to 58. But they were aberrations. Really, they're not long enough to interrupt the essential march of events through the Tudor period, the march towards the bourgeoisification of society. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, one of her first tasks was to restore social and financial stability. To this end, she reformed the currency, not something that people generally hear about much, but it was one of the first things she did, and then secured a settlement with the church in England, which then became the Church of England, steering a middle path between the two extremes of her brother and sister. An Act of Parliament was passed making it compulsory to attend the Reformed Church every Sunday on payment of a fine. But payment of a fine is a far cry from what had happened under her predecessors, when those who didn't agree were burnt at the stake. So the burning stopped. And what we have now, what we're looking at this epoch in English economic history, is what is called the period of primitive accumulation. And this is how Christopher Caldwell described the period in which Shakespeare was born on or about 23rd of April 1664. We don't actually know the date of his birth. He was christened in Holy Trinity Church, Stratford-upon-Avon, on 26th of April. And it's known that the custom was to be christened within a few days of birth. So it's a matter of convenience. People have said, oh, well, he was born on the 23rd, which chimes quite nicely with the fact he died on the 23rd of April as well, and it's St George's Day. Caldwell is the only reliable Marxist historian of the English Revolution and Civil War. He was writing in 1937 in his book on English literature, Illusion and Reality. I propose...
That is Caldwell.
Oh, right, okay then. And I'm mixing them up. So forget the last bit, I am quoting Caldwell.
He's not a historian, he's
No.
a literary writer.
Okay. So I propose to quote at some length from part 4 of this book, where he describes the period of primitive accumulation, for nowhere have I found it more vividly and succinctly described. Capitalism requires two conditions for its existence: masses of capital and free, i.e. expropriated, wage labourers. Once the movement has started, capitalism generates its own conditions for further development. The sum of constant capital grows by accumulation and aggregates by amalgamation, and this amalgamation, by continually expropriating artisans and other petty bourgeoisie, produces the necessary supply of wage labourers. We saw the expropriation of the peasants driving off their land was stage 1 of this. A period of primitive accumulation is therefore necessary before these conditions can be realised. You have to have something to prime the pump, to get it moving before it starts working automatically. This primitive accumulation, says Caldwell, must necessarily be violent and forcible, for the bourgeoisie, not yet a ruling class, has not yet created the political conditions for its own expansion. The state is not yet a bourgeois state. In England during this period, the bourgeoisie and that section of the nobility which had gone over to the bourgeoisie seized the church lands and treasure and created a horde of dispossessed vagrants by the enclosure of common lands, the closing of the monasteries, the extension of sheep farming, and the final extinction of the feudal lords and their retainers. The seizure of gold and silver from the New World also played an important part in providing a base for capitalism. This movement was possible because the monarchy, in its fight with the feudal nobility, lent on the bourgeois class and in return rewarded them for their support. The Tudor monarchs were autocrats in alliance with the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisified nobility. In this period, the period of primitive accumulation, the conditions for the growth of the bourgeois class were created lawlessly. To every bourgeois, it seems as if his instincts, his freedom, are intolerably restricted by laws, rights and restraints, and that beauty and life can only be obtained by the violent expansion of his desires. Intemperate will, bloody, bold and resolute, without normal measure, is the spirit of this era of primitive accumulation. The absolute individual will overriding all other wills is therefore the principle of life for the Elizabethan age. This life principle reaches its highest embodiment in the Renaissance prince in Italy and England, at this time leaders in primitive accumulation. This figure of the prince expresses most clearly the bourgeois illusion. Just as in real society the prince is the necessary means of realising the conditions for bourgeois expansion. To break the mould of feudalism and wrench from them capital requires the strength and remorselessness of the absolute monarch. Any established bound or let to the divine right of his will would be wrong, for such bounds or lets being established and traditional could only be feudal, and would therefore hold back the development of the bourgeois class. At this stage, the strength and vigour of the bourgeois depends upon his cohesion as a class under the monarchist leadership. In many parts, already a self-armed, self-acting commune, the bourgeoisie of England has as its spearhead the court. The court is the seat of progress, and its public collective life is for the moment the source of bourgeois progress and fountain of primitive accumulation. The court itself is not bourgeois. It seeks the coercive imposition of its will like a feudal overlord, but it can only do so by aligning itself with the bourgeoisie, for whom the absoluteness of the monarch, although feudal in essence, is bourgeois in its outcome, because it is creating the conditions for their development. And that's an important contradiction and a point that we'll be coming back to when talking about Shakespeare's plays. George V. Plekhanov, in his treatise Historical Materialism and the Arts, states that in the moral conceptions of men there is nothing absolute, that they change as social conditions change. That again is a vital thing to remember. I do not have the time or space to repeat or even summarise all his arguments and all the examples he discusses to prove the point that, and I'm quoting again, human beings have a sense of beauty, a special kind of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, which depends upon the environment in which they were brought up and live and act. So there is no such thing as absolute beauty. It is relative. It depends upon where, when we were born, how we live. And he says also, historical materialists have consistently maintained that if human nature is immutable, then it cannot explain the historical process, which presents as a sum of constantly changing phenomena. On the other hand, if human nature changes with the course of historical development, then it is evident that there must be some objective cause for these changes. Therefore, it is the duty both of the historian and of the sociologist to go beyond the limit of discussions about human nature. And that is precisely what I'm aiming to do today. I have sought to follow Plekhanov's instruction by sketching the social, political, and above all the economic characteristics of the society into which Shakespeare was born in 1564. The 16th century witnessed the flowering of the arts in England. A new secular learning and a new philosophy supplanted the old scholasticism. Grammar schools were not new under the Tudors, but they achieved a new importance with the dissolution of the monasteries, which had been the primary seats of learning and sources of education in medieval times. When Henry VIII decreed that schools should all include Latin in their curricula, a flood of translations was released of philosophers, scholars and historians, as well as of the ancient poets. And with the end of the cleric's monopoly of literacy and the growth of trade, a new class of educated administrators was needed for government and commerce. The grammar schools taught not only Greek and Latin language and literature, but also the English language and oratory. There was little or no literature in English at this point. So Shakespeare was born into a society that was in a ferment of change, discovery and creativity, as well as of uncertainty and danger. He was the son of a glove maker, a craftsman of one of the old guilds, but also one of the class that was giving birth to the new bourgeoisie. His mother, Mary Arden, was the daughter of a prosperous landowner and a relative of minor nobility. His father was prosperous during the first part of Shakespeare's life, rising to the status of alderman, a leading figure in the commerce and government of the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. In that capacity, he, that is Shakespeare Senior, had to enforce the new religious laws, for example by securing the whitewashing of the murals on one of the guild's chapels in the town. And he, that is Shakespeare Senior, would have been present at leading social events, such as the visits to the town by wandering players, when he's likely to have had his whole family, including his son, with him. He was also able to send his son to grammar school, and although it's not known for sure, but it's believed that William was at grammar school until he was about 15, when a change in his father's fortunes meant that he had to leave school and he briefly joined his father's business. Now, much was made during the last century of the fact that William Shakespeare never went to university, unlike his contemporary poets and universities. It was common to suggest that a glover's son could never have written the poems and plays ascribed to Shakespeare, and the true author must have been an aristocrat, such as Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, or the writer and philosopher Francis Bacon, hailed by Marx as the first materialist, or even fellow dramatist Christopher Marlowe, although Marlowe predeceased Shakespeare by some years. And Shakespearean scholarship in the last century generally had a metaphysical approach, and I've told you how awful that was in terms of unreadability. Modern scholarship has an eye on publishing books which can be read by the general public and not solely by fellow academics. And the leading Shakespearean scholars today also look into the known facts about Shakespeare's life and times in great detail, relating the play's subject matter and text to what was happening to Shakespeare and to society in general at the precise time each play was written. And this essentially materialist approach has incidentally provided a wealth of evidence to show that the writing of the poems and plays could only have been carried out by the glover's son turned actor from the English Midland town of Stratford-upon-Avon, situated between farm and meadow and forest, who also had close ties to the countryside. All of those factors are clear through his plays. His knowledge of the people, of the countryside, of the skills that he would have learned in the course of his upbringing. As I said earlier, bourgeois critics, bourgeois academics, even while they're busy making some money on the side by publishing books that are entertaining and readable, and I do recommend them as such, nevertheless are bound to deny the class content of Shakespeare's writing, just as they seek to deny the class content of all culture, that being the requirement of the ruling imperialist class right now in its efforts to maintain its rule by keeping its hold over people's consciousness. But for real enlightenment on what makes Shakespeare great, we must turn to Alexander A. Smirnov. When I saw my first Shakespeare play in the 50s at the age of 13 and fell in love with his work, I could not explain why I loved it. When I was introduced to contemporary Shakespearean scholarship at the age of 15, I had to admit defeat. I would never be able to explain or fully understand myself what was so magical about his work. When I read Smirnov's work, finally I had the key to understanding Shakespeare. It is natural, in my view, for young people to be optimistic. If they are not optimistic here in Britain today, that is a further indictment of the moribund stage of imperialism, which cannot offer a bright future to anyone. But I was optimistic as a young person in the 50s. Life was ahead of me, and its possibilities seemed endless, whatever I chose to be if I worked for them. I believe now that it is this optimism in Shakespeare, the vigour of his language, characterisation and plot, that struck then and still strikes a chord in me. It is still this optimistic humanism that makes his works valuable to the new rising class of the proletariat. To be a Marxist-Leninist is to be an optimist, as we look for a better future for mankind. If you're a pessimist, you can't be a Marxist-Leninist. And Shakespeare was writing as a member of the rising class, the new bourgeoisie, at the most optimistic stage of its development. The old limiting ties of feudalism were being broken, and new opportunities for personal growth and development in every sphere were opening up. The possibilities seemed limitless. Individualism then was a revolutionary philosophy, unlike now. Only towards the end of his career did the contradictions in the new bourgeois class relations become apparent. Along with his freedom came the corollary that all future human relations were to be defined in future solely by the cash nexus. And a matter which is worth noting, Shakespeare did not earn his living by writing plays. There was no money in writing plays. He was an actor before he started writing. His first published works were his long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, which were published in 1593 and 94, when the theatres were closed for 2 years due to the plague. And the first reference in writing to Shakespeare as a playwright is to be found in an article published in 1592, so near the beginning of his life in London. But such poems were popular in London, and they did, at the time, and they did make him money. But how he really made his money was when he set up as the owner of a share in the Globe. So not only did he write and perform at the Globe, but he shared the takings. And theatre was immensely popular. Theatre was the radio, the cinema, the television, the internet of its time. It was new. Secular theatre was new. The church had disappeared as a source of colour and stories and entertainment. The theatre was the new way to get information and entertainment. And as long as the theatres were open, and there were many of them in the Elizabethan era in London, there were a couple of dozen theatres, and that's a lot. And they were open during the day. It was a daytime occupation because they were under the sky, generally speaking. And attendance was a penny. You put your penny into a pottery box, like a piggy bank, and you were allowed entrance as a groundling. And then the boxes would be taken behind the stage and smashed in order to retrieve the money. And we think that's the origin of the term box office. That's what happened. That's how. And in fact, the archaeologists have found under the site of the Rose Theatre on the South Bank masses and masses and masses of pottery shards of these smashed boxes. And incidentally, a penny, purely irrelevant information, but at the same time, Westminster Abbey was a tourist hotspot, would you believe? And it was also a penny to get into Westminster Abbey. The penny would get you entrance to the theatre, and they were immensely popular. So that was how Shakespeare made his money as owner. A bit like David Foster in the 1960s, who wrote and appeared, but also owned the copyright to his shows, and that was how he made his money too. So Shakespeare was an entrepreneur, and he learned, the fact that his father had financial difficulties, Shakespeare was more careful with his money, and he retired quite as a prosperous. Now Shakespeare never pretended to invent his plots and stories. He based his history plays on Holinshed's Chronicles, his Roman plays on Plutarch's Parallel Lives, his Italian plays on, among other things, Caccio's Decameron. Then got a few of his sources. He was heavily influenced by Christopher Marlowe, who in fact preceded him as a playwright. And nearly every one of his plays can be found to have had a previous incarnation at the hands of another writer. But Shakespeare transformed them with all his own genius of observation and language. In view of the fact that English as the language of government and religion was in its infancy, remember up until then the church was in Latin, everything was in Latin in the church. Only with the Reformation was it in English, the Bible, the prayers, the Book of Common Prayer. They both appeared during Shakespeare's lifetime. And the language of the court during the Plantagenets had been French. So now for the first time English is the language of government and of religion. And so, of course, an enormous new vocabulary is required. And you can see the importance of the grammar schools. And it may well be that's the reason why so many words and phrases, which are now familiar to us, first appear in print in Shakespeare's plays. It's impossible to say whether he invented them or whether he merely used what he heard about him. I'm now going to turn to Smirnoff's article. Now, he has analysed every single one of Shakespeare's plays. I'm clearly not going to do that, but I am going to convey some of his conclusions. He also sets the scene by talking about the economic circumstances of the English Renaissance. Shakespeare, we have to understand, is a humanist. and that was the philosophy of the rising bourgeoisie. They believed in the importance of the self, not in supernatural forces, not essentially in religion. You can see what that links in to Protestantism, because Protestants also believe that they are equipped to interpret the Bible and don't need interpreters. And Smirnov is comparing Shakespeare to the other humanists of his time. We do not therefore expect to find any specific bourgeois content in Shakespeare, which is normally absent from the works of the great humanists of the epoch. Marlowe and several other dramatists of his group exemplify this theory. This is also true of the humanists of other countries. Shakespeare followed this trend, so not specifically bourgeois content. It was even more natural that he should have done so, because the circumstances attending the historical development of England, the fusion between the nobility and the middle classes, created conditions extremely favourable to such an art. In discussing the evolution of law, Engels says, the form in which this happens, however, can vary considerably. It is possible, as happened in England, in harmony with the whole national development, to retain in the main the forms of the old feudal laws, while giving them a bourgeois content. In fact, directly giving a bourgeois meaning to the old feudal name. And Smirnov says, is this not equally applicable to the literary scene? Shakespeare found subject matter and imagery of a feudal character to be a convenient form for the following reasons. The traditional dramatic plots, the blending of nobility and bourgeoisie, the avoidance of middle-class limitations. Since the substance was completely bourgeois, through contact with the new content, the form was materially changed. Shakespeare is a humanist ideologist of the bourgeoisie of the time, for whom the source material of his plays had no importance, and which, as Engels has pointed out, he did not disdain to borrow even from the Middle Ages. He was concerned only with how he could adapt this material. His reaction to the world around him and to the changes in the political and social currents of his time were strong but complex. They found expression not in impulsive outbursts or obvious allusions to the evils of the times, but in profound internal upheavals and changed evaluations of humanity and of the whole life process. In view of this, Shakespeare's work, in spite of the internal unity and the correctness of its basic ideology, falls into three periods. And I'm going to look at it in the light of these three periods. Smirnov says, during the first period, that's 92 till about 1601, there occurred the coalescence of all the foremost forces of the country, upper middle class, the monarchy, the gentry, even part of the land nobility. This process is reflected by the joyous optimism of Shakespeare's early work, which is filled with the bold and happy affirmation of life, and with obviously aristocratic elements. He has two main themes: the assertion of the new absolutist national state, and the intoxicating joy of living now available to the individual, at last emancipated from feudal bondage. To the first theme, he dedicated the cycle of chronicle plays. To the second, that's historical plays. To the second, the sort of enchanting gay comedies. But the effects of the disintegration of the class alignment are already apparent in the plays written towards the end of the period, around 1597. The decomposition of the court had set in. The Puritans were becoming more and more aggressive. The struggle between the bourgeoisie and the nobility had already begun. And of course, that was to reach its sharpest point at the time of the Civil War. But up until then, when Shakespeare was first writing, they were in alliance. The bourgeoisie, bourgeoisified nobility, and the court were in alliance. Hence, he says, once the struggle begins, the tragic treatment of royal power in Julius Caesar, with its confused conclusions, its pessimism, and the gloomy overtones of the much earlier Much Ado About Nothing. During the second period, 1609 to 1609, so this we're talking about from 1601 to 1609, which marked the decline of Elizabeth's reign and the advent under James I of feudal reaction, the process of disintegration was completed. The nobility, with the support of the monarchy, was preparing to defend its position against the imminent onslaught of the bourgeoisie and the gentry. So the contradictions are sharpening. Vacillation, evasion, compromise were no longer possible. He who was not afraid to burn his fingers had to make a choice. You had to be on one side or the other. Shakespeare made his. He broke through the circle of superficial aristocratic emotions, discontinued the gay comedies and the idealised depiction of the past, written in celebration of that glorious present which was no more unity. With powerful tragedies as well as sharply dramatic comedies, he entered the arena as champion of the heroic ideals of bourgeois humanism. Shakespeare, however, was not destined to retain his position. Reality was against him. The age of humanism was at an end. Narrow, fanatical Puritanism began increasingly to permeate the bourgeoisie, and this in turn affected Shakespeare. He was forced to choose between the degenerate royalists and the revolutionary, though sanctimonious, Puritan hagglers. Shakespeare therefore made a slight compromise. Without betraying either his basic principles or his social, ethical and political convictions, he made certain ideological concessions which affected even his style. During this third period, 1609 to 1611, he wrote a series of tragi-comedies. Psychological analysis and definitely motivated action began to disappear. Grim realism gave way to fairy tale and legend. Shakespeare became preoccupied with complicated, cleverly constructed plots as demanded by the public. His plays were once more filled with those purely decorative aesthetic elements, masks, pastoral, fairy scenes, which abound in the first period of his plays of his first period and are completely absent in those of his second. This was a celebrated reconciliation with life that Shakespearean scholars delight to discuss, says Smirnoff, but which actually weakened his genius. Shakespeare could not long endure such self-imposed violation of his artistic integrity. For the last time, he gave full voice to his humanist credo in his swan song, The Tempest. 5 years before his death, at the height of his creative power, he stopped writing for the theatre, 1611, and he retired to Shakespeare. He retired to Stratford-on-Avon. Nevertheless, in spite of the critical phases through which he passed, the basic characteristics of Shakespeare's point of view and style, his militant, revolutionary protests against feudal forms, conceptions and institutions remained unaffected throughout his life. Smirnoff says, what were those characteristics? First of all, a new morality based not on the authority of religion or on feudal tradition, but the free will of man. On the voice of his conscience, his sense of responsibility towards himself and the world. Secondly, a scientific attitude towards the world, life and reality, which, rejecting all metaphysical interpretations, demands a causal explanation of all natural, social and psychological phenomena. And Smirnoff says the possibilities of such a scientific approach in reality were very limited in Shakespeare's time. Nevertheless, this is the essence and the basis of Shakespeare's creative method. Finally, says Smirnoff, the characteristic of Shakespeare, the energy and optimism so characteristic of the Renaissance. Inactive natures, sunk in abstract dreaming or hedonism, or lacking a sense of responsibility towards themselves and towards humanity, were destined by Shakespeare either for destruction or ridicule. And this approach is one of the most significant aspects of the new ethical philosophy of humanism as Shakespeare understood it. And finally, I'm going to look, but very briefly, at a couple of examples, just to show you how this philosophy is shown through his plays. And I urge you all to find and to read this article, because I tell you, you will look at Shakespeare and understand and enjoy him in a new way once you've read the analyses of all his plays in the light of this. And now, his first period, from 1590 to 1600, included the romantic comedies, realistic comedies, romantic comedies, and the chronicle plays. I'm going to look at just one, and I've chosen this one because it's very well known, and therefore requires no explanation from me, and two, because Kenneth Branagh has formed a theatre company, and they're going to produce Romeo and Juliet in the summer, and it's going to be available in the cinemas. So you can actually go and see it and look at it again in the light of this new understanding. Before I get to that, I'm going to look at one other from this period, The Merchant of Venice. Another one that's very familiar, the story is very familiar to everyone. The Merchant of Venice, says Smirnov, although classified as a comedy, ought not, strictly speaking, to be so termed. The chief problem is of a broad socio-moral nature. Out of two medieval legends, Shakespeare created a profound play in which two worlds are contrasted. One, a world of joy, beauty and friendship, is represented by Antonio and his friends Portia, Nerissa and Jessica. The other, a world of rapaciousness, greed and malice, is represented by Shylock, Tubal and their servants. In the preceding comedies, reconciliation was possible. Evil could become good. In The Merchant of Venice, however, this is not so. The war between the two worlds is a war to the death. The conflict is not racial, so many critics contend, but social. Shylock tells us this in so many words. Quote Shylock, "How like a fawning publican he looks. I'd hate him, for he's a Christian. But more, for that, in low simplicity, he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of business here with us in Venice." In the same vein, he explains the character and causes of Antonio's hatred for Shylock. He hates our sacred nation, and he rails, "Even there, where merchants mostly congregate, on me, my bargains, and my well-run thrift, which he calls interest. Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him." So in both of those examples, you're seeing that the emphasis is actually on the economic. Thus, the racial conflict is immediately superseded by a greater one, the class conflict. But what is the social basis of these two groups? The social structure of the play is simple. Its title, The Merchant of Venice, does not refer to Shylock, as is often assumed, but to Antonio. Antonio's class position as a practical and wealthy merchant is clearly stated at the beginning of the exposition, where Antonio's friend Graziano addresses him. "You look not well, Signor Antonio. You have too much respect upon the world. They lose it to buy it with too much care." Antonio immediately denies this. However, since these words were uttered by Graziano, so intimate a friend of Antonio, we are justified in assuming that they properly reflect Antonio's activities. Nor does it follow that because Bassanio ruined his business with his wasteful extravagance, he, as an idle, parasitical aristocrat, he was, the hard-working, efficient merchant who lived on a luxurious scale, spending his profits lavishly and head over heels in debt, was a typical figure of the Renaissance. Unquestionably, Antonio's whole circle, amongst whom there is not a single nobleman, belong to the patricians of the Venetian merchant class. It is of no consequence that the business activities of his friends, Lorenzo, Graziano, Solonio, are not shown. Shylock does not represent the entire bourgeoisie, but only one of its elements. He is a moneylender. Usury was but one aspect of capital, and met with moral and legal disapprobation at this time. The lawmakers tried to regulate money lending, the moralists inveighed against it. Even if Shakespeare did not differentiate between the two forms of capital, still in Shylock he depicted a representative of the least productive and most rapacious section of the bourgeoisie. In creating Shylock, Shakespeare was attacking the enemies of humanism, the Puritans. As a perfect example of the wealthy merchant adventurer, Antonio is brave, enterprising, generous, and key to the love of life and aesthetic ideals of the Renaissance. But Antonio is not a feudal aristocrat. And the efforts of some critics to defend their view that the play shows anti-Semitic tendencies, they insist that Shylock was envisaged as a comic character, according to the old theatrical tradition. But this is untenable, says Smirnov. In the first place, Shylock is not a simple comic character like the clowns. His personality is complex. In the second place, even the purely comic characters often express pertinent, profound ideas. the claim that the unity of Charlotte's personality is destroyed if his speech is taken seriously. That is the speech where he talks about of Antonio. He has disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, heated my enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Then he says, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? And that, says Smirnov, is an argument for showing that he is not a racist. He is, in fact, contradicting the view that Jews are a race apart and to be objectified as such. And Shakespeare, Smirnov says, causes the audience alternatively to hate and to sympathise with him. But Shakespeare's realistic art and his objectivity spring precisely from such complex figures and evaluations. And he says in Othello, he again surmounts the racial problem in the same inspired manner. We're not going to look at Othello today. So I'll then go on to the Chronicles. In his Chronicles, Shakespeare fully revealed his political philosophy, his attitude towards royal power and his understanding of the historical process. The basic theme of all his Chronicles, the affirmation of the principle of absolutism as the only power strong enough to suppress the anarchy of feudalism. That, says Smirnov, is what makes the Chronicles so interesting. One major idea runs through all of Shakespeare's Chronicle plays, the problem of state power. Perhaps even more significant is the fact that they also contain, in undeveloped though clearly evidenced form, the philosophy of the historical process. As emphasised by Marx and Engels, the social background in Shakespeare is not a mere detail of the plot, as the bourgeois critics conceive it to be. On the contrary, the social background is the causal explanation of the plot. Since scientific learning was practically non-existent in Shakespeare's day, not even Bacon had succeeded in laying its foundations, Shakespeare's persistence, though unformed striving to discover causal explanations of the historical process were remarkable. The chronicle plays of Shakespeare are permeated with the idea of the inevitability of the historical process. Evil inevitability, which the second calls it. There are many references to the times and the spirit of the times. The Earl of Westmoreland, Henry IV, Part 2, replies to the accusation of the rebellious feudal nobles with, "O my good Lord Mowbray, construe the times to their necessities, and you shall say indeed, it is the time and not the king that doth you injuries." In like manner does the rebel Hastings defend his behaviour in Henry IV, Part 2. We are time's subjects, and time bids be gone. The role played by individual temperament and personality in shaping the course of events is not minimised, but the individual is helpless to cope with the force of circumstances. This is shown by Warwick when he comments on the Earl of Northumberland's treason in Henry IV, Part 2. There is a history in all men's lives, figuring the nature of the times deceased, the which observed, a man may prosify with mere aim of the main chance of things as yet not come to life. In other words, if you understand what's happened properly and the forces that made it happen, then you can see the way things are going and understand what is to come as well. Yes. Now I come to Romeo and Juliet. And Smirnov says the social aspect of the love theme in Romeo and Juliet is more obvious than in Shakespeare's other comedies. Here it becomes the struggle of the new man of the Renaissance against the feudal order. This struggle takes the form of a demand for freedom in love and opposition to antiquated moral traditions. The fact that the type of hereditary family feud exemplified by the Montagues and Capulets dates from pre-feudal times is of little consequence, since feudalism adopted and even perfected the blood feud. Nor is it any greater importance that the two families involved are not members of the feudal aristocracy. They are bourgeois patricians, rather than members of the new bourgeoisie in the epoch. of the epoch of primary accumulation, thoroughly medieval urban Philistines, Smirnov calls them, permeated by feudal ideas. The struggle of the lovers against their social environment is the struggle of bourgeois humanism against feudalism, the Renaissance against the Middle Ages. The second period, from 1600 to 1609, includes the greatest tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens, as well as some comedies. Troilus and Cressida, All's Well that Ends Well, Measure for Measure, and Pericles. Smirnov says these comedies differ from the buoyant romantic comedies of the first period. They lack his joyous love for the beautiful forms of life and his light, playful humour. Instead, there is such an overtone of tragedy that the term drama would be more suitable. We have previously attempted to explain this metamorphosis in Shakespeare's creative genius. The last years of Elizabeth's reign and the first years of the reign of James I were marked by a grave political cleavage which caused a spiritual conflict in Shakespeare. His philosophy became tragic, but not gloomy, nor despondently pessimistic. Despite the austerity of his tragedies, they almost always end on a note of courageous, heroic affirmation of life. According to Shakespeare, the value of life is in heroic struggle, even if this struggle ends in defeat. And from this period, I would look just at Hamlet. Again, something I have to explain what the story is. You will know it. Smirnov says, Hamlet, which begins the series of Shakespeare's tragedies, is the most difficult to analyse. The idealist criticism of the 19th century, and this we're all familiar with still, claimed the basic idea in the tragedy to be the conflict between Hamlet's thought and will. In other words, he thinks, but he can't act. In which he appears as the victim of dominance of thought over will, a martyr to reflection, incapable of realistic action. Smirnov does not agree with this. He says this idea, however, is utterly false. It sprang from 19th century German petty bourgeois thought, which strove to comprehend and justify its political and spiritual impotence. Actually, Hamlet is capable of action to the highest degree, even of heroic action. The idea of conflict between thought and action was alien to the artists of the Renaissance, and particularly to Shakespeare, who could not conceive of thought as divorced from action. What, then, prevents Hamlet from avenging his father's murder? And what Smirnov says is, essentially, Hamlet repudiates the idea of the blood feud, the feudal idea that, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, you killed my father, I'll kill you. Under such a circumstance, what Hamlet sees is the decay of the society around him. It is not so much his hesitation as the tone which Hamlet adopts when he speaks of his revenge that proves him lacking in willpower. No conflict, however, exists between his thought and his will. He is horrified by the crime, by his mother's inconstancy in marrying the usurper ere those shoes were old, and by the rampant hypocrisy and debauchery of the entire court, even of his beloved Ophelia, a debauchery and hypocrisy which he attributes to the world at large. It never occurs to him to take revenge as an act of personal justice. Firstly, because his father is dear to him. Secondly, because Hamlet views this private crime as only an indication of the general corruption of the age, of universal and irreparable evil. Under such circumstances, personal revenge is futile. He therefore overcomes his narrow subjective tendency to become a merciless judge of his epoch. So what type of action could such a thought produce? Only one: inner renunciation and departure from this world. For Hamlet, the heir to the throne, a man of passionate, energetic nature, with inherent capacity for appreciating the full joy and beauty of life, this is an act of tremendous strength. The traditional idea of ancestral revenge, an idea existing in society before social classes, and which later became one of the bases of the feudal world outlook, is minimised and almost utterly discarded in the tragedy. Hamlet is not entirely free from the idea of revenge, but he has lost the urgent impulse for it. He is essentially a man of the new age, a humanist. As proof of this, Shakespeare introduces the theme of ancestral revenge on 2 occasions, once in connection with Laertes and again with Fortinbras. In both instances, their reactions are utterly different from those of Hamlet. Laertes, when he learns of his father's death, behaves like a feudal lord, bursting into the palace with armed men to demand an answer from the king. Fortinbras, on the contrary, has no belief in the efficacy of ancestral revenge. Like a skillful man of business and a diplomat, he uses it merely as an excuse for political advancement. He is a thorough representative of primary accumulation. Hamlet stands midway between these 2 men. In the process of becoming a new man, a humanist, he frees himself only with difficulty from the old feudal outlook. He becomes a rounded humanist, while Fortinbras remains a mere talented opportunist. Hamlet suffers because he is far in advance of his time. It is possible to interpret this attitude of Shakespeare in terms of the decay of absolutism around him in 1600. The degeneracy of the English court stood out in sharp relief. Shakespeare depicted it with unusual depth, transferring the scene to Denmark. It's interesting to note in this context that Shakespeare, almost uniquely amongst his contemporaries, was never imprisoned or censored. He managed to convey his messages always without reference to current politics or events, and yet the message was clear for those who could understand it. And also, if you note, without any reference to supernatural or religion. There is no religion in any of Shakespeare's plays. Supernatural only becomes apparent in his 3rd period, to which I will now pass. And I'm nearing the end of this. The 3rd period was 1609 to 1611, and there are very few plays written in this 3rd period. Really only 3 are fully Shakespeare's own: Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. This was the period, says Smirnov, of Shakespeare's compromise and partial capitulation. The presentation of problems is less vivid, the emotional and ideological conflicts less strong. Themes which during the 1st and 2nd periods were presented in the light of heroic struggle against a broad social background have now lost some of their former vigour and colour. We find in The Winter's Tale the theme, but not the tragedy of Othello. And in The Tempest, that of Romeo and Juliet. A happy ending is assured by the very tone and character of the exposition, stated by Prospero in the very first act of The Tempest. There is no tragic tension. There is only captivating, slightly disturbing activity which ends happily. These are all typical tragedy comedies. And in these, you get the supernatural being a force in the action, which was not the case in the earlier plays. So the conception of a fate stronger than man's will or intellect appears for the first time in these plays. It is radically different from that of Fortuna, that's the goddess of luck, which played so important a role in Shakespeare's earlier comedies. There too, chance operates more than once, but only expresses the coincidences which are indicative of the unlimited possibilities of real life, a feeling typical of the Renaissance. These combinations, which could not, because of their complexity and boundlessness, be controlled or discounted by reason alone, in the endless game of life, man's will and reason are the most important factors. It was the feeling, the urge to conquer and master the unknown, which animated the bold and enterprising merchant adventurers of Elizabethan England, and induced them to risk their lives and all their wealth. Such is the meaning of Fortuna, a purely Renaissance conception. An entirely different philosophy permeates the plays of the last period. In every one of them, the role of destiny is to stand guard over man's thought and will. The supernatural becomes a powerful agent in motivating the action. As a corollary, the psychological analysis, the driving force of the action, the emotional transformation, and the revelation of character are weakened. The emotional changes which the characters experience are unexpected and at times even incomprehensible. We would cite a number of other points to show how Shakespeare, in these last expressions of his genius, surrendered his former position and yielded to the taste of the reactionary aristocracy, which held such triumphant sway over the London stage in 1610. Shakespeare, nevertheless, had not yet abandoned the most essential aspects of his credo. In all three plays, he still insists, although in an indistinct voice, masked by a wealth of ornamentation, on his former demands: truth, moral freedom, nobility, and creative love of life. I'm not going to look at those plays in any detail. I want to end with a summary on Shakespeare's world perspective. According to Smirnov, which I think exactly sums up why Shakespeare was great, is great, and remains great. Shakespeare was a humanist, a thorough representative of the epoch that Engels called the greatest progressive revolution mankind had known up to that time. Inasmuch as he expounded the new morality, the new philosophy and ideology, which were about to replace those of deteriorating feudalism, Shakespeare was an integral part of his epoch in the broadest sense of that word. But because 1,000 threads bound to the specific conditions which attended the development of capitalism in England, he also belonged to his generation. He was a man of his time. The ideological contradictions and the extraordinary complexity of his work are due even more to the combination of these two factors than to the evolved socio-economic conditions of his time, although these two were important. What Engels called bourgeois content in feudal form is always manifest in his works, often in the same play and even in the same act there may be found conflicting ideas. This complexity has so bewildered the bourgeois critics that they have gone so far as to maintain that Shakespeare was a genius who merely presented all the possibilities and tendencies of human thought with no consideration or awareness of the world's perspectives. It is necessary not only to indicate the complexity of the plays, but to determine its causes, the organic rather than the formal unity. And Smirnov says, the organic unity of Shakespeare's work emanates from his striving to mirror objectively the life process by distinguishing the fundamental from the accidental, the permanent from the transitory, and to interpret this process in the light of the new world perspectives. Contradictions mentioned previously prevented Shakespeare's world perspective from fully crystallising. This world perspective is therefore revealed only as an aspiration and a tendency, which, because of the nature of the class that had championed it, could not be realised. The bourgeoisie abandoned the optimistic humanism when the Puritan strand became dominant, when it passed through the period of accumulation into the period of establishment of capitalism proper. It would be futile, says Smirnov, to attempt to find a prescribed morality in Shakespeare. His morality is a general tenor, not consisting of dogmatic tenets, but of broad rules of conduct. From his own generation, Shakespeare drew the material for the concrete expression of these abstract principles. He says the principle of trust in Hamlet, King Lear, the principle of conscience in Othello, Macbeth, the principle of mercy in The Merchant of Venice and Measure, and so on. Even surpassing these is the principle of the creative love of life and the heroic struggle for the preservation of its best aspects. Shakespeare, however, does not sermonise. He is never didactic. The tragic and comic elements were presented with equal force, however they are not confined to tragedy and comedy respectively. And that was one of the great characteristics of Shakespeare that distinguishes him from the later French dramatists, particularly, who very much modelled themselves on the classical Roman and Greek method, whereby you had a very restricted action, and it was either all a comedy or all a tragedy, limited in time and place. Shakespeare had a much broader canvas. Smirnov ends, the conclusion that Shakespeare was the ideologist of the bourgeoisie is inescapable. It is impossible, however, to designate him as such without reservations. The rapacity, greed, cruelty, egoism, philistinism, so typical of the English bourgeoisie embodied in Shylock, Malvolio, Iago, are no less scathingly denounced. Shakespeare was the humanist ideologist of the bourgeoisie, the exponent of the programme advanced by them when, in the name of humanity, they first challenged the feudal order, but which they later disavowed. This enabled Shakespeare to subject his class to keen and profound criticism, a criticism motivated by a definite, though not clearly formulated, ideal. His strong sense of concrete reality deferred him from creating a utopia, yet he possessed utopian ideals. At a later stage of bourgeois development, Shakespeare became a threat to that class which gave him birth. The bourgeoisie have never been able, says Smirnov, to understand or accept the revolutionary elements in Shakespeare's work, because these immeasurably transcend the narrow confines of bourgeois thought. They have attempted, therefore, to transform his revolutionary humanism into specious philanthropy, and to interpret his concepts of mercy and truth as tenderness and righteousness, his continued appeals for patience, perseverance in the struggle to attain the ideal as submissiveness, his disregard for religion and metaphysics as philosophical and religious tolerance. And so the bourgeoisie have crowned him with the empty title, the universal man. And that is what we will hear a lot in this coming year, that he was somehow above and beyond the confines of the time and the class, and yet he was not. That does not make him less, it makes him greater. He represents the most revolutionary aspect of the bourgeoisie at a time when it was at its most revolutionary, breaking the bonds of feudalism. And it is still that revolutionary element, essence of Shakespeare, that we can find striking a chord with us. I hope that you will read this and go to see Shakespeare and understand his work in a new way after today. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil, for dealing with this very difficult topic in so short a period of time. And because of the time constraints, obviously there's a lot that's been said very quickly, which you may not have completely got the essence of, and therefore it's very important that Basil writes this up for us and we can produce it as a pamphlet which would be available to you. But all the same, we've got to use a certain program, you catch the drift of it. You get what's been said. Shakespeare was not only a playwright, but a very successful playwright and a very successful actor. And as Maisel said, if not the only one, he was one of the very few who wasn't jailed, who didn't lose his neck. And he didn't lose his neck because he had this ability to put his criticism of the powers that be in such a way that he either borrowed characters from foreign lands, very often says these things through jesters and fools, or mad people who are simply raving about and they cannot be taken seriously. But it's very often his most profound messages are through exactly these fools, jesters, and madmen, and of course characters borrowed from foreign countries. Much easier to talk about Prince Hamlet of Denmark rather than some local king, because you would be in trouble. He was quite capable of saying, in one of his characters where he says, put a dog on the throne and he suddenly acquires authority, right? And obviously it's a criticism of probably James I, but it's done in such a way that nobody could easily, probably some clever ones did, nobody could easily suspect that he was in any way criticizing James I, because it would be very difficult in those days of Britain to criticize James I directly, and those who did came a cropper. So, Maisel, thank you once again very, very much for dealing with this very difficult topic. And it is something that we should study Shakespeare. And his popularity is not undeserved. Even if the restoration of Shakespeare, after a forgetfulness of 100 to 150 years, has happened under different colors and it doesn't bring out his essence, nevertheless, he deserves to be actually respected, not only by the ruling class, but more so in our days by the working class, to be able to understand actually the process of thought, of artistic development in this country.